Oh, I've got the prettiest mother. I've got the nicest mother. That's what I tell everybody. I say I've got the sweetest mother in the world. If she wants a little boy that bad, why doesn't she take one out of the orphan's home?
Welcome to episode 7 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we explore 2 films and multiple rabbit holes to create something far greater than the sum of its parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week there's something very wrong with the children as we explore 2 movies that tap into anxieties about parenthood and generational power dynamics. First up is Village of the Damned from 1960, starring George Sanders and Barbara Shelley, in which a group of mysterious children take control of a small English village. Then we're heading to another village, only this time in Spain, for Who Can Kill a Child from 1976, which poses the question, how far would you actually go to protect yourself, even if the danger comes from those that society has sworn to protect? Both of this week's films tap into paedophobia, or the fear of children, and turn the traditional idea of childhood innocence inside out, replacing it with corruption, hostility, and violence. They also explore what happens when we are forced to break the ultimate taboo in order to protect ourselves, our families, and perhaps even the world. But before we get into all of that, as always, I'd like to mention the key references that I have used in creating this week's episode. I'm covering quite a lot of ground again this week, so these are just the main references, and as always, all of them will be listed in the show notes. For the discussion on Village of the Damned, I have referred to the book English Gothic, Classic Horror Cinema 1897 to 2015 by Jonathan Rigby. I've also referred to an article on reactormag.com by Carly Wallace, which is called Village of the Damned, Killer Kiddos from Outer Space, and an article by Les Wright called Village of the Damned, which is on culturevulture.net. I've also referred to a 2003 Guardian article entitled Return of the Cuckoos, and that was written by Mark Berman. And for the section on Who Can Kill a Child, I have drawn heavily from the book Spanish Horror Film by Antonio Lazaro Rabol, an interview with Narciso Ibáñez Serrador, and an interview with Kim Newman, both of which are included in the Mondo Macabro Blu-ray Special Edition release. And for both films, I've also referred to the book Evil Seeds, the ultimate movie guide to villainous children, and that was edited by Vanessa Morgan. The idea of the evil child is one that's haunted literature and cinema for decades, and is a trope that is still very much alive today. We can trace its roots back to the concept of the changeling from folk legends and fairy tales, stories in which the fairy folk would steal human babies from their cribs and leave behind one of their own, a sickly, strange, or malevolent substitute that parents would unknowingly raise as their own child. This idea appears in folklore from around the world, and it's possible that such tales were used to explain illnesses, developmental differences, or a child who simply didn't quite belong. The Brothers Grimm in Germany collected a tale that was simply called The Changeling, in which a mother suspects her child has been swapped and has to use trickery to shock the changeling baby into revealing its true identity. Over in Ireland, the legend inspired W.B. Yeats' famous poem The Stolen Child, where fairies lure human children away with promises of escape from sorrow, though of course, that always comes at a cost. Meanwhile, from my home county of Cornwall in England, local folklore gives us the story of the Changeling of Minewater, in which a miner's child is replaced by a piskie, or Pixie for those born outside of the county, and only returned after the parents follow a set of rituals involving fire and iron. In literature, one of the earliest examples of the corrupted child comes with the novella The Turn of the Screw, which was published by Henry James in 1898. In this story, a governess in a country house becomes convinced that the two children in her care are possessed by malevolent spirits. This was later adapted into any number of film versions, starting with The Innocents in 1960, and then with increasingly diminishing returns until the story was reimagined more successfully by Mike Flanagan in his series The Haunting of Bly Manor in 2020. But in this story, much like in The Tale of the Changeling, it is an external force that corrupts the children, and it would not be until much later that we would be introduced to the idea that a child might have been, quote-unquote, born bad. In 1946, Ray Bradbury published his short story, The Small Assassin, in which a mother inexplicably takes against her newborn baby and believes that it is trying to kill her. Her fears are initially dismissed as a form of postpartum depression following a very difficult birth, but a subsequent series of accidents cause first her husband, and then the family doctor, to suspect that she might in fact be correct. Bradbury followed this the same year with his story Let's Play Poison, in which a teacher, recovering from the death of one of his students, starts to believe that children are, quote, little monsters sprung from hell because not even the devil can stand them, end quote. Stephen King, a longtime fan of Bradbury's, wrote a sort of homage to this in his 1972 story Suffer Little Children, featuring another beleaguered teacher who may, or may not, be imagining things in the classroom. As mentioned in last week's episode, in 1950, Richard Matheson's story Born of Man and Woman was printed in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and then in 1953, Jerome Bixby published his short story It's a Good Life, and introduced readers to Anthony Fremont. In the story, Anthony is a 3-year-old with a quite bewildering array of psychic abilities: telepathy, mind reading, teleportation, and the ability to create life, to name but a few, and who punishes any transgressions simply by thinking it so. This was famously adapted into an episode of The Twilight Zone in the 1960s, in which Anthony was aged up to 6 years old, and which is now seen as an allegory of totalitarianism, with every action, opinion, or even thought risking the violent displeasure of a megalomaniacal toddler. It was also remade for the 1983 Twilight Zone movie, where, possibly under the influence of Steven Spielberg, the aged-up 8-year-old Anthony wasn't so much bad as misunderstood, and just needed the support of a kindly teacher. I'm sure you can imagine which version I prefer. A year later, in 1954, William March published his novel The Bad Seed, a bestseller in which a mother slowly realizes that her 8-year-old daughter Rhoda is in fact not the sweet and charming girl she pretends to be, but is in reality a sociopath, and is likely responsible for the death of a classmate, the family pet dog, and a babysitter. This story was adapted into a long-running Broadway play, and then a film of the same name in 1956, which was nominated for 4 Academy Awards and 2 Golden Globes. Whilst The Bad Seed was concerned with the debate over nature versus nurture, Lord of the Flies, released the same year by William Golding, had very little doubt as to the root of childhood evils. In his novel, a group of English schoolboys are stranded on an island, where, deprived of adult supervision, they descend into ritual cruelty. Golding himself later called this collapse into savagery a symptom of the, quote, terrible disease of being human, end quote, suggesting that in humanity there is an inherent capacity for evil. And then in 1957, British writer John Wyndham published his novel The Midwich Cuckoos, which is the source material for our first film this week, Village of the Damned. And so by now you may well be asking yourself the quite legitimate question, what on earth was happening in the late 1940s and 1950s, and why were so many fictional children turning bad? The answer to this is, of course, not a straightforward one, and instead springs from a melting pot of circumstances that would all combine to give birth to the nightmare child genre. Firstly, and importantly, we need to consider the impact of 2 world wars and the trauma that they instilled in the generations that they left behind. Having witnessed firsthand the horrors that mankind can inflict upon itself, it is little surprise that many writers developed an incredibly bleak view of human nature. William Golding, after serving in World War II, wrote in an essay that he had discovered what one man can do to another, and that he was particularly disturbed by the actions of what he called ordinary men, who perpetrated quite brutal acts of violence. He went on to write, quote, "My book was to say, you think the war is over, and an evil thing destroyed, that you are safe because you are naturally kind and decent. But I know why the thing rose in Germany, and I know it could happen in any country." End quote. William March had served in World War I and had been the victim of mustard gas attacks and suffered trauma, physical injury, and post-traumatic stress disorder, or as it was known at the time, shell shock. During the 1930s, whilst living in London, he began a period of psychoanalysis with his doctor, Dr. Edward Glover, who had dedicated much of his practice to addressing juvenile delinquency and psychological disorders of youth. This, combined with March's post-war fascination with the idea of good and evil, laid the foundations for the novel The Bad Seed. He started planning the book long before it was published, telling a colleague as early as 1938 that he was considering writing a novel about a homicidal little girl. In the decade that the book was published, juvenile delinquency began to be far more common, or at the very least was more widely reported, and the nature versus nurture debate began in earnest. March leant heavily into the discussion, doubtless inspired by the work of his psychiatrist, and with The Bad Seed, he created a work that has been quoted as recently as 1993 in publications about psychopathy. For March, the answer to the debate is firmly on the side of nature, with the story depicting Rhoda not as the victim of a broken home or of childhood trauma, but as quite literally the bad seed of the title, born with no capacity for empathy, no conscience, and no morality whatsoever. Ray Bradbury, on the other hand, wrote the story The Small Assassin for other reasons. On a personal level, he claimed that he could remember every moment from his childhood, including his birth and the, quote, camera angle, end quote, as he emerged into the world, as well as the associated physical and emotional pain. He even claimed to remember his circumcision when he was just 3 days old. If this is indeed true, then it is possible he had an extremely rare condition, which is known as hypothymesia, or highly superior autobiographical memory, HSAM for short. And if this is indeed true, one can see exactly what inspired him to create a baby that was so resentful of leaving the womb, where all of its needs have been met, that it begins to conspire against its parents. However, he also went on to say that the story is a way of understanding the destructive principle that exists in any child, and by extension, in mankind itself, echoing the themes which led to both Lord of the Flies and The Bad Seed. And whilst this no doubt explains some of the evil child genre that was rapidly emerging, another social issue doubtless also fed into the mix, and that was the spectre of juvenile delinquency. By the time that The Bad Seed was published in 1953, juvenile delinquency in the US had risen considerably, and the number of young people that were brought before courts more than doubled between 1948 and 1956. The war had violently disrupted the family unit, with fathers away fighting and mothers going to work to keep things going at home. This gave rise to a generation of latchkey kids who took on greater responsibility and autonomy. With no adult supervision, the young soon became acclimatized to the new freedoms, which they were not really quite so ready to give up when the war came to an end. Sadly, this desire for autonomy clashed with the post-war aspiration to return to the status quo and social conformity, creating anxieties in adults and in media about troubled youth, and giving rise to a new cultural phenomena, the birth of the teenager. Suddenly, in a new age of consumerism, teenagers had their own money, and with money came cultural influence. The culture was characterized by rock and roll, and an urge for experimentation with fashion and hairstyles, all a far cry from the pre-war period of the 1930s. The media, of course, did not help, fanning the flames with concerns about the breakdown of family values, citing immoral behaviour, and of course blaming comic books. But while society fretted in horror, Hollywood, of course, saw dollar signs. In 1953, Marlon Brando became a screen icon with the film The Wild One, in which he answered the question, "What are you rebelling against?" with a laconic, "What do you got?" This film was effectively banned in the UK for 14 years when the censor refused it a certificate due to its violence and aggression. It's certainly a classic of its period, though I must admit that it is now pretty impossible to watch, after it was brilliantly pastiched by David Lynch and Michael Cera in Twin Peaks: The Return. 2 years later, James Dean would appear as brooding teenager Cal in the movie East of Eden, and then again in the same year, but sadly posthumously, as Jim Stark in the film Rebel Without a Cause, joining Natalie Wood and Sal Mineo as a trio of troubled youth, at the same time setting a trend for male teenage dress that continues to this day. But it wasn't just post-war trauma, the dark heart of humanity, or teenage delinquents that were causing concern. This was also the decade where fears about rapid population growth really began to take hold, with concerns that there would be insufficient resources, leading to mass starvation and poverty. 1948 saw the publication of the books Our Plundered Planet and Road to Survival, which fed into the fears of a quote-unquote population bomb that would continue well into the late 1960s. Not helping the matter were other fears around scientific advancement. Significant progress was being made in embryo and cloning research, and experiments on tadpoles were the first to demonstrate viable cloning techniques. Add into this mix the ever-present spectre of the atomic bomb, the Cold War with the USSR, and the idea of enemies from within, and you get a sense of some of the cultural anxieties of the time. The future of humanity was all looking rather bleak, and what better way to represent these anxieties than through the inversion of the supposed innocence of children? All of which brings us on to our first film this week, Village of the Damned from 1960. This was directed by Wolf Riller and is based on the novel The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. It stars George Sanders, Barbara Shelley, Michael Gwynne, and Martin Stevens. Author John Wyndham was born John Wyndham Parks Lucas Bainan Harris on the 10th of July 1903 in a village near Birmingham in England. After leaving school at the age of 18, he spent several years trying out different occupations before he began publishing stories in the mid-1920s. Writing under the pseudonyms of John Bainan or Lucas Parks, his works were printed in American pulp magazines, like Amazing Stories and Wonder Stories, and had titles like The Lost Machine, The Moon Devils, and, possibly my favourite of the titles, Tyrant and Slave Girl on Planet Venus. He also published a series of novels using these pen names, including titles such as Foul Play Suspected, The Curse of the Burdens, and The Secret People. During World War II, he served in the British Army and was part of the Normandy landings. Much like William March and William Golding, the war exposed Wyndham to the fragility of society, a theme which would recur in his subsequent novels. In 1951, he published The Day of the Triffids, this time under the name for which he is now better known. The novel depicts a world where most of the population has been blinded by a mysterious meteor shower, and has as a result become vulnerable to a mobile and highly aggressive species of plant, known as a Triffid. It was an immediate success and was made into a film in 1962. This movie, a British production starring Howard Keel and Jeanette Scott, deviates from the novel in a great many respects, not least the inclusion of a segment featuring a couple in a lighthouse, and this was directed not by the original film director Steve Seckerly, but instead by Hammer Studios regular Freddie Francis. As it turns out, the studio was less than happy with Seckerly's final cut, and brought in Francis to tidy up the movie and add the additional sequences. It's quite honestly the sort of monster movie to be watched on a Saturday afternoon drinking a cup of tea, and is very enjoyable, as long as you're not expecting it to be faithful to its origins. This was followed by a far more faithful BBC TV adaptation in 1981, which ran over 6 30-minute episodes and starred British actor John Deteen. There was also a far less faithful BBC miniseries in 2009, and 3 different radio dramas have also been aired. I understand that a new version is in the works, and this will be coming from part of the team that created the TV series Chernobyl, so I have my fingers crossed for that one. And of course, the novel and the 1960s movie are also a clear inspiration for the opening of the movie 28 Days Later, with its central character awakening in a hospital bed to discover a suddenly completely transformed world. Subsequent works by Wyndham include The Kraken Wakes in 1953, about an underwater alien threat and the slow flooding of coastal cities, and The Chrysalids from 1955. This is my personal favourite of his novels, and is about a post-nuclear society gripped by religious fundamentalism and fear of any perceived physical and mental deviation from the quote-unquote norm. He followed this with The Midwich Cuckoos in 1957, which we are talking about in a moment, and The Trouble with Lichen in 1960, which is about the discovery of a substance that can slow the aging process. His final novel, published during his lifetime, was Chucky in 1968, about a young boy who begins communicating with an alien intelligence. Many people of my generation will have fond memories of the TV show of the same name from 1984, which was shown in the children's TV time slot on ITV. At the time of their publication, Wyndham's novels were both commercially and critically successful, with The Day of the Triffids never going out of print. However, some later writers have criticised his work for being too cosy and too safe, which for me is missing the point a little, or missing the point a lot. His stories are often deeply pessimistic about both human nature and scientific progress, and explore themes including societal breakdown, control, conformity, and survival. The juxtaposition of these themes against their, admittedly, old-fashioned British settings is often quite deliberately jarring, and the Guardian newspaper has said, quote, "His innocuously English backdrops are central to the power of his novels, implying that apocalypse could happen at any time, or indeed be happening in the next village at this very moment." End quote. Writers such as Margaret Atwood, the author of The Handmaid's Tale, have cited Wyndham as an influence, and David Mitchell, the author of Cloud Atlas, has called The Chrysalids, quote, "one of the most thoughtful post-apocalypse novels ever written. Wyndham was a true English visionary, a William Blake with a science doctorate." End quote. In addition to his novels, he also wrote many short stories, including one called More Spinned Against, which I first encountered in an episode of a children's TV show called Spine Chillers in 1980. This story is not really one for arachnophobes, but it's a short tale about a man who collects spiders, one of which turns out to be the Greek goddess Arachne, with whom his wife makes a dangerous bargain. Wyndham was a very private man, and he gave relatively few interviews. He married late in life in 1963 to Grace Isabel Wilson, with whom he had shared a very long relationship. Sadly, he died just 6 years later in 1969 at the age of 65. And now we are getting into the spoilers, So if you want to watch the film knowing nothing, it's time to hit pause. The book tells the story of the village of Midwich, where one afternoon, all of the residents lose consciousness for several hours. 2 months later, all women of childbearing ability discover that they are pregnant, which, for some, is scientifically impossible, as they are, in fact, virgins. When the children are born, all, of course, on the same day, they grow at an alarming rate and begin to demonstrate powers of telepathy and mind control. The film broadly follows Wyndham's novel, but it does make some significant changes. Whilst the book is told by an outsider to the village of Midwich, the film drops him entirely and centres the action on the character of Dr. Gordon Zellaby. The number of alien children in the village is also drastically reduced, while subplots about similar colonies being born in other countries are reduced to a couple of throwaway lines. Doubtless some of these changes are due to budgetary considerations and also the need to fill a specific runtime. But in this instance, keeping the action confined to the village is actually incredibly effective. The title was of course changed as well. The book's title is a metaphor to the idea of cuckoos being brood parasites, laying their eggs in another bird's nest where they will eventually hatch, grow, and push out the bird's actual offspring, much like the idea of the changeling that we discussed earlier. Director Wolf Riller had been a writer and a producer for the BBC before he decided to move into filmmaking. It's been suggested by more than one person that his BBC background is what gives the film its rather understated and serious tone, grounding the movie and avoiding overly stylized imagery. This, though, is not to say that the film is without its own sense of humour. There is a quite brilliant moment just after the village awakes where Gordon Zellaby and his military friend Alan walk through the village before coming to a stop in front of a school crossing sign. And the sign, of course, bears the legend, "Beware of children," a wry foreshadowing of what is to come. Shot by cinematographer Geoffrey Faithfull, the film is presented in stark black and white, with a surprisingly mobile camera, particularly in the opening as it pans and floats around the village and visits the unconscious residents in the film's pre-credit sequence. The rest of the presentation is rather more functional than artistic, though it services that function well, most notably in the scenes where the children come under attack and exert their influence. The score by composer Ron Goodwin works beautifully and feels very British, much like Wyndham's writing. Beginning with a pastoral sequence to underline the idyllic nature of the village and the surrounding countryside, it progresses to discordant tones and organ notes to amplify the creepier moments. Another sound design choice that creates a significant sense of unease is the decision to re-loop David's dialogue in post-production, which creates a very strange quality to his voice that accentuates his otherness. Now, whether this was a creative choice, or more likely done to improve clarity, it creates an intriguing effect. The lead role had been offered to actor Russ Tamblyn, who had been nominated for an Academy Award for his performance in the movie Peyton Place in 1957. Tamblyn would go on to star in West Side Story in 1961, The Haunting in 1963, and, for fans of David Lynch, as Dr. Lawrence Jacoby in Twin Peaks. Tamblyn, however, did not take the role, and it initially went to English actor Ronald Colman. Colman had won an Academy Award for Best Actor in the 1947 movie A Double Life. However, he sadly passed away before production on Village of the Damned could begin. And when the movie was relocated to England, the role finally went to another Oscar-winning actor, the velvety-voiced George Sanders. I'm going to talk about Sanders for a moment, and also his brother Tom Conway, who was also an actor and who starred in Val Lewton's movies Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, and The Seventh Victim. George Henry Sanders was born on the 3rd of July in 1906 to English parents in St. Petersburg in Russia. His family left Russia shortly after the 1917 revolution and moved back to England, sending young George to Brighton College, which is, oddly enough, just down the road from me as I'm recording today. After school, he drifted firstly into advertising, then modelling, and finally the stage and movies. And to be honest, it's hard to imagine his distinctive silky voice and commanding presence belonging anywhere else. He appeared as Simon Templar, otherwise known as the Saint, in a series of low-budget but wildly popular films, though he eventually became rather bored of the role and passed it on to his real-life brother, Tom Conway. Then he became another sleuth in the Falcon series of movies, a role which he also passed down to his brother Tom when he had had enough of that too. George and Tom had, what is fair to say, a strained relationship, and as you can imagine, Tom lived very much in his brother's shadow, though he had some notable success himself. As I mentioned, he starred in 3 films for Val Lewton's RKO Studios, and to my chagrin, I watched these for years before I realised that there was any relationship between Conway and his brother. It was only when a friend pointed out that the two shared a similar presence, look, and, in particular, voice, that I realised they were, in fact, related. You too may spot these similarities in voice if you ever watch Walt Disney's 1953 movie of Peter Pan, in which Conway was the film's narrator. He also appeared in several television programmes, including an episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents called The Glass Eye in 1957, for which he received critical praise. The two brothers also appeared together in the film Death of a Scoundrel in the same year, playing actual brothers, though leading role Sanders does end up killing Conway, who had a more supporting role in the film. Very sadly, and like many stars of his generation, Tom struggled with alcoholism, and he was arrested in 1960 for drink driving, which was reported in the American national press and greatly harmed his reputation. His career, though, was finally laid to rest by health problems, with issues affecting his eyesight and his mobility. Though George helped him financially for a time, things eventually soured. By the end of Tom's life in 1967, the brothers were estranged, and Tom died in near poverty. On hearing the news, George was reportedly, and quite understandably, devastated. It is, though, quite understandable that Tom felt that he lived in his brother's shadow, as while he was quietly impressing in B-movies that would become cult classics, his brother was a bona fide movie star. George appeared in Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca in 1940, The Picture of Dorian Gray in 1945, and The Ghost and Mrs. Muir in 1947. But his greatest triumph came in 1950, with his Academy Award-winning performance as theatre critic Addison DeWitt in the movie All About Eve, opposite Bette Davis, and in which he also appeared against a very young Marilyn Monroe. He also lent his very distinctive voice to the tiger Shere Khan in Disney's film The Jungle Book in 1967. Sanders was married 4 times, including very briefly to Zsa Zsa Gabor. In 1960, he published his autobiography, which was entitled The Memoirs of a Professional Cad, and quite frankly, the title says it all. But the roles dried up, and his health declined. His final movie, released posthumously, was a film called Psychomania in 1973, in which he plays a satanic manservant, or quite possibly the devil himself. It is a very low-budget British exploitation movie that has gone on to be something of a cult classic, and has also been absorbed by the folk horror movement. A year before the film's release, in 1972, and at the age of 65, Sanders checked into a hotel in Spain. Here he swallowed a handful of barbiturates and left behind some of the most sardonic last words of all time. His suicide note that he left simply read, quote, "Dear world, I am leaving because I am bored. I feel I have lived long enough. I am leaving you with your worries in this sweet cesspool. Good luck." End quote. Sanders is joined on screen by Barbara Shelley, who plays his wife, Anthea Zellaby, and who is, quite honestly, an icon in British horror cinema, not only for her role in this movie, but also Hammer's Dracula, Prince of Darkness, Quatermass and the Pit, The Gorgon, and Rasputin the Mad Monk, to name just a few. She also, incidentally, appears in a film called Ghost Story from 1974, which is something of a cinematic curiosity. In this movie, which for budgetary reasons was set in England but shot in India, she stars alongside Marianne Faithfull, Penelope Keith, and an actor called Vivian McCarroll, who was the inspiration for the character of Withnail in the movie Withnail and I. I don't think it's a particularly good film, to be honest, but it's very interesting for the casting, if nothing else. One of the key criticisms of Village of the Damned is certainly one that Barbara Shelley agreed with. Given the themes of enforced pregnancy and women having no bodily autonomy, one might have expected the female characters to be given more to do. But this is a movie that is entirely male-centric. In an interview given to Scarlet Street magazine in 1994, Barbara Shelley said, quote, "The film has become a classic, but there was no scene in the film with a chance for the women to dramatise their situation. I don't think it showed the human side." End quote. She makes a very valid point, as there is very little exploration of the aftermath on the psychology of these surrogate mothers, and this would have made an interesting angle, and one which is notably absent when watching from a modern perspective. Instead, the film's focus is far more centred on the male character's reaction to the situation, as well as Gordon's growing scientific fascination with the children, and his relationship with their own alien progeny, David, played by Martin Stevens. Horror fans will recognise Stevens not just from this film, but also from the 1961 movie The Innocents, where he appeared alongside Pamela Franklin. His parents withdrew him from acting at this point to concentrate on his education, and he wouldn't return to the screen until 1965. His final film appearance came with Hammer Films' The Witches in 1966, which we touched on briefly last week. After this, he retired from acting altogether at the ripe old age of 17 and switched to studying architecture, which led to a successful career. In a 2003 interview with The Guardian, which reunited the original children at the film's exterior location of Lechmore Heath in Hertfordshire, Stevens recalled, quote, "I knew that it was an unusual part. I quietly liked having these very adult qualities and having control over the adults. Imagine having that power. I could taste a bit of that. You realise how powerless you are as a child, and I don't think I found that part too much of a stretch." End quote. He, along with the other children in the film, gives a remarkably creepy performance, completely emotionless and unfailingly polite. His exchanges with Barbara Shelley as she tries to mother him are genuinely uncomfortable to watch. When one of the children is nearly hit by a car, the clearly shaken and apologetic driver is compelled to return behind the wheel and then drive into a brick wall, which interestingly foreshadows the climax of the film. This is not an act of self-preservation, but one of vengeance, and it illustrates not just the growing power, but also the intent that lies behind it, underlined by David's half-smile as Anthea looks on in horror. This need for vengeance has already been demonstrated in an earlier scene, in which the newborn but rapidly growing David exacts a revenge on Anthea for an improperly cooled bottle of milk. After the car crash incident, the driver's brother Jim, looking for revenge, approaches them with a shotgun, which he is then compelled to turn on himself. It's important to recognise that he had already tried to leave and posed no real threat, but the children, reading his mind, dispose of him anyway. It's no wonder then that some have seen this film as an allegory for authoritarianism. It is in these sequences, in which the children use their telepathic powers of mind control, that we are introduced to one of the few special effects in the film, and it's actually one that didn't make the original British release at all. In post-production, effects were added which gives the children glowing eyes whenever they use their powers, and the British censor was alarmed by this, believing that it would be far too frightening for the proposed certificate. So in the British version, the effect of the glowing eyes was removed altogether. This effect has, of course, gone on to become possibly one of the most famous images in the film, but I'm going to be honest, it's one that I could quite happily live without. Though sadly, most streaming services now only play the US print. And this is doubly annoying, as the US print also has a closing special effect of glowing eyes floating up from the school fire, which, again, I could quite frankly do without. Quite what the children represent has been open for debate since the novel first appeared, and this debate has just been intensified by the film's cult status. On a surface level, of course, the story is one of alien invasion, but other writers have suggested that it alludes not only to historical fascism, but also to fears of the Cold War era. It's an interesting idea, and once heard, does give a special resonance to the line that David says later in the film. If you didn't feel emotions, you could be as powerful as us, which could possibly be seen as an allusion to communism. The mysterious pregnancies have also been called out as referring to cloning research that I mentioned at the very top of the show. Many of these themes are explored far more effectively in the novel, and whilst the film does hint at a few of them at points, it fails to do very much with them after that. This, of course, is not to say that I don't like the film, because I wouldn't be talking about it unless I did. Personally, I love its somewhat orderly and very British approach, which not only echoes Wyndham's novels, but also acts as a juxtaposition to the more outrageous elements of the story. In this respect, the film is very much like the children that it depicts, hiding its menace under a veneer of respectability and good manners. It's also helped enormously by Sandra's performance, and by Barbara Shelley. As I mentioned earlier, her awkward exchanges with David are uncomfortable, but they also have a tragedy to them, a sadness, as she attempts to form a connection with him, only to be politely and coldly rebuffed. The film opened in the UK in 1960 and soon attracted audiences. Made on a budget of approximately $250,000, or $2.5 million today, it earned the studio a profit of $860,000, which today would be about $9.5 million, so nearly 4 times its original budget. Of course, with every film's success comes an inevitable sequel, and Children of the Damned, starring Ian Hendry, was released in 1964. This is a different proposition to the original, and the children are portrayed as more sympathetic characters. It was not so well received, either critically or commercially, though some of the ideas are interesting. There was also a remake in 1995 from John Carpenter, starring Christopher Reeve and Mark Hamill, and is not a particularly successful film. This is in part down to the fact that it was a contractual assignment for John Carpenter, and a film which he really wasn't passionate about. Unfortunately, that lack of passion shows, and it is at best a rather mediocre retread of the earlier and far more successful film. Today, the film is recognised as a classic of science fiction cinema of the period, and it's also recognised as a key influence on the evil child trope, one which would progress through the 1960s and 1970s with films like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, and of course the ultimate cuckoo in the nest horror movie, The Omen. And this influence can certainly be seen in the 2006 remake of The Omen, in which young Damien has far more in common with the residents of Midwich than he does with the original Harvey Stevens feral 1976 version. The influence is also very present in our second film of this week's Double Bill, and we're going to leave England now and head overseas to a village in far sunnier climes with Who Can Kill a Child from 1976. Directed and written by Narciso Ibáñez Serrador, and I'm going to refer to him by his nickname as Chicho for this episode. It was adapted from a novel by Juan José Planes, though a bit more on that shortly, and it stars Louis Flander and Prudella Ransom. We discussed Chicho Ceredor back in episode 1, when I spoke about the golden age of Spanish horror. Though he only directed 2 feature films, of which this is the second, his influence on Spanish genre cinema cannot be overstated. He also managed to bring a very different kind of horror, possibly of a very existential nature, to British Saturday night light entertainment TV, but more on that a little bit later. Born in 1935 in Uruguay, his father, after whom he was named, and his mother Pepita, belonged to travelling theatre troupes that toured Latin America and Spain, and his father actually had quite the showbiz story. He began his career as a child star, and when he tired of this as a teenager, it is reported that he travelled to Hollywood and learned special makeup techniques from the man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney. Taking his newfound talents back home, he adapted classic horror stories for the stage, including ones by H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe, and created a theatre of horrors that would tour successfully across the 1940s and the 1950s. When he and Pepita divorced in 1947, the young Ceredor, who was nicknamed Chicho, stayed with his mother as she toured, and they eventually moved to Spain, while his father settled in Argentina. Nearly a decade later, father and son would be reunited when the now-grown Chicho would travel to Argentina to persuade his father to adapt the horror theatre repertoire for television. In 1959, they created a series called Masterworks of Horror for Argentina's then only TV station, presenting weekly episodes that adapted classics of the genre. The elder Ceredor performed in the episodes and took charge of the visual elements. Chicho scripted the episodes himself under a pen name of Luis Penahel. The series was a huge success, and the production company commissioned a movie of the same title, as well as a second series which aired in 1967, and a third and final one that screened in 1962. This third series included 2 original episodes from Chicho himself, again writing under the name of Penahel. The duo moved on and worked on an Argentinian sci-fi series called It May Come True Tomorrow, which presented episodic adaptations of classic science fiction, largely by Ray Bradbury, but again included some original stories from the pen of Chicho. In 1963, Chicho rejoined his mother in Spain to perform in the play, and he also brought with him his television portfolio. He sought out the director of Televisión de España, or TVE, which had been founded just 6 years previously. The director, a man called José Luis Colina, was so impressed by Chicho's work that he invested in his career, and the timing could not have been more fortuitous. At the time, the Franco government had a burning desire for Spain to be seen as a culturally liberal and creative country, and they were investing in new studios and in the resources required for production. Ultimately, they wanted to create television that would win awards at international events. This initiative, sponsored by the Ministry of Information and Tourism, was called, with great subtlety, Operation TV Awards. And in a case of right place at the right time, Chicho Ceredor fit right into the plan. His Spanish TV debut was performing, directing, writing in the anthology series Studio 3, which presented a variety of stories across a number of genres. During this period, he was also offered the opportunity to remake his 2 Argentinian series, with the Spanish version of It May Come True Tomorrow debuting in 1964, and the Spanish version of Masterworks of Horror, retitled as Tales to Keep You Awake, airing in 1966. Tales to Keep You Awake, which introduced Spanish viewers to televised horror and fantasy, was a huge success and earned itself a second season in 1967. It also made Chicho a household name, as each week he delivered an opening Rod Serling-style monologue, introducing the episode to an enraptured audience. His opening monologue for the very first episode clearly sets out his agenda. Quote, "Each Friday, you will be able to watch a story that will keep you awake. stories which differ from each other, but which have something in common. Our purpose is to cleanse, or attempt to cleanse, the horror and suspense genre of its cliches, its commonplaces. Put simply, our aim is to translate onto the small screen a suspense series, whose main aspiration is not to achieve shocking, horrific impacts, but rather to offer small doses of quality. As in the Argentinian version, the series adapted stories from classic horror writers, and was critically well received, though there were, of course, those who felt that it was too graphic, too gruesome, and even repugnant. Regardless, the series was a success, and by 1968, Chicho was hailed as the most important man working in Spanish television. Surely then, the time was right for him to step into the world of movies. In 1969, he released La Residencia, or The Finishing School, which was retitled outside of Spain as The House That Screamed. Set in France at the end of the 19th century, it focuses on, surprisingly, a finishing school, where headmistress Lily Palmer rules with strict discipline. Essentially, the school is a microcosm of Franco's Spain, with Palmer aiming to, quote, return young women who have gone astray to the correct path by treating them with utmost rigour and discipline, end quote. She also represses her son's sexuality, admonishing him that he must wait for the right woman, the perfect woman. What follows are a series of murders, as well as simmering suppressed sexuality, a heady mix that found huge favour at the domestic box office. The film became the highest-grossing movie in Spain at the time, earning 100 million pesetas, which is the equivalent of $18 million today. It's also been hailed as a forerunner of the slasher genre, and was repeatedly shown on Spanish television for many years, earning it new fans with each airing. However, Chicho was not at all happy with the way that it had been promoted, which he felt was tired and cliched, the very things that he was trying to move the genre away from. In addition, the film came in for a fairly harsh reception from many critics, who felt that it was generic, tired, and cliched, though this is possibly more down to a distaste for the genre than any real critical objectivity. We need to remember, of course, that horror was still very much in its infancy in Spain at the time, and the critical eye on the genre was, therefore, probably not the most favourable one. Worse still, the critics declared the film didn't even look Spanish, and they said it was derivative of Hitchcock. Whether down to critical reception, unhappiness with the marketing strategy, or some other unspecified reason, Chicho returned to television, and he wouldn't direct another film for 7 years. In the meantime, though, he found huge success on the small screen with the creation of a TV game show entitled 1, 2, 3, Respond Again, which proved to be so popular that it was exported internationally. In the UK, it became something less of a game show and more of an existential nightmare, where it was retitled 321 and aired on Saturday night television. This UK version was hosted by so-called comedian Ted Rogers and featured a pasted-together-at-the-last-minute mascot called Dusty Bin. It asked contestants to guess the answers to clues that were incomprehensible at best, or to avoid taking home the dummy prize of a rubbish bin, and hopefully to win a car. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I will try to post some clips of it on our Instagram, and if any of you can work out the logic behind some of the answers, you are a far smarter person than I am. But back to Spain. Chicho would return to the cinema in 1976 with Who Can Kill a Child, a film that was inspired by a conversation with the novelist Juan José Planes. And here we are going to get into spoilers, so if you want to watch the film before progressing any further, it's time to hit pause. If you're in the UK, this is admittedly not an easy film to find, though if you have a VPN, you can find it streaming internationally on Prime in Italy and Apple TV and Prime in France. Writer Juan José Planes had an idea for a novel in which the children of the world unite in rebellion, an act of vengeance against all of the crimes that adults have inflicted through war, brutality, and barbarism. Planes says he wrote the narrative after a vivid nightmare which depicted children crying beside their mother's corpse in the Vietnam War. He shared the idea with Chicho, who, in turn, used it as the basis for this movie. Planes' novel would actually come out in the same year as the film, and Chicho has pointed out in an interview that there are some significant differences between the two. Quote, Planes wrote the novel after I wrote the screenplay, but there is something I want to make very clear. And that is, for example, in the novel, what provokes the children's rebellion against the adults is a yellow powder that falls all over the village. This was a little absurd and fantasy-like. And, well, that should be enough to tell you that while Planes gave me the idea of the story, that was enough for me to write the script. That said, I don't want to undermine or play down Planes' original idea, but there are lots of differences between the novel and the script. End quote. Indeed, Planes' novel does blame the violence of the children on a sort of yellow pollen that mysteriously covers the land, and this pushes the narrative more into science fiction territory, and perhaps something more akin to the work of John Wyndham. In the film, the explanation for the violence is never fully given. It appears to be transmitted by close contact, but whether it is an actual disease or a violent form of groupthink spread by telepathy remains unspecified. And to be honest, it's of fairly little significance. In an interview given for the Mondo Macabro Blu-ray release, Chicho would explain, quote, This film is about the rebellion of the children, because in a certain way, the children are the main victims of what consciously or unconsciously adults bring about. That is, we kill them. We kill them with wars, we kill them with bombs, we kill them with famine. The children are always the victims. End quote. This message is one which is presented front and centre in the opening of the European release, though it was cut for American audiences. This shows brutal documentary footage of real-world atrocities, including the Holocaust and the Vietnam War, to name but a few. The footage focuses on the horrors inflicted on children by their elders and is incredibly jarring. It also seems to go on for an uncomfortably long time, confronting the viewer with the realities of what we perpetrate. On my first viewing of the movie, it genuinely left me quite shaken, and there has been much discussion on whether it is in fact necessary for the film at all. Chicho himself has acknowledged this inclusion as a mistake, though more about its placing in the movie than its inclusion altogether. He believes it now would have been better at the end of the movie, and that this would have helped viewers understand the real-world context of the children's rebellion. To be honest, I would agree with him. Its placing at the front of the film is incredibly jarring, but it does also feel a little bit like giving the punchline of a story before telling the lead-in. Much like And Soon the Darkness 2 weeks ago, this is shot in bright sunlight, and our protagonists, English couple Tom and his heavily pregnant wife Evelyn, are forced to continually flee for their lives under a blazing Spanish summer sun. The cinematographer, Jose Luis Alcaine, shot with a Mediterranean summer brightness, saying, quote, If you do a summer daylight, the audience is a bit stunned and scared because they think it could happen to them. End quote. He also recalled that he declined the director's occasional suggestions of more obvious horror effects, like a menacing wall shadow, and opted instead for naturalism. Their working relationship was an extremely good one, with Chicho explaining that their previous work together helped enormously. Quote, I always call him because he is an excellent cameraman. He is so good that it's enough to explain to him for 15 minutes how you want the look of the whole movie, and he'll do it for you. It was a really pleasant shoot. End quote. Alcaine would go on to work with Pedro Almodóvar on many of his films, including Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down, Volver, and The Skin I Live In. He won the European Film Award for Best Cinematographer for Volver, and has also received 5 Goya Awards for Best Cinematography. The shoot was completed in about 9 weeks, with its speed facilitated by Chicho's screenwriting approach, of which he says that he doesn't shoot with the camera. The way that he shoots is with a pen and paper. As he writes the script, he visualizes it, so that later he just has to transfer, in the most faithful way, exactly what he has visualized in his head and written on the page. Not that it was all plain sailing. The film met an enormous challenge during pre-production, with much of the Spanish coast overpopulated by tourists and modernized with skyscrapers, so they struggled to find a location that would suggest isolation and provide the emptiness required for the island setting. Eventually, they found a small town in the province of Toledo, and then the dock sequences were shot in Menorca. For the character of Tom, Chicho originally pursued Anthony Hopkins, however eventually cast actor Louis Flanders. For whatever reason, Serrador doesn't really have fond memories of the actor, saying that he didn't like him that much. He had a far better relationship with actress Prunella Ransom. I've not been able to find any interviews with her discussing her thoughts on the film, but she gives an incredibly impressive performance, as does Louis Flanders, to be fair. Because of its graphic content, the film encounters censorship in several countries and was substantially cut. I've already mentioned that the prologue was removed from the US release, and many of the more violent scenes were also cut. In the UK, the film received cinema distribution, but was flagged during the 1980s video nasty Moral Panic, and only officially cleared uncut many years later. It is, for its time, a very violent film, made more disturbing by the fact that, unlike Village of the Damned, the children are, essentially, behaving just like children. This is beautifully foreshadowed at the start of the film, with a sequence of small children swinging at a piñata. This is, of course, repeated later on the island, only the piñata has been replaced by a hanging man being beaten to death. This is the first actual evidence of the children's capacity for violence, and it is genuinely shocking, though we have earlier glimpsed a partial dead body lying behind the shelves of the empty convenience store. Much like Stephen King's Children of the Corn, which was written a year later, the children have massacred the adults on the island, but unlike the King story, they do so with an almost playful innocence as opposed to religious fervour. According to Chicho, quote, "They act like children because they are children. This is just some sort of game that they play, even though it's a macabre game." End quote. This approach, of course, supports the film's central tenet, but also feeds into the dilemma faced by Tom and Evelyn. How far would you go to protect yourself against a group of young children? Had they been depicted as monsters, or as some form of other, the question would be an easier one to answer. And quite honestly, even today, it's hard to not be shocked by the climactic machine gun sequence, even when you know exactly what the children have been doing. The look of bewilderment on the face of one of the survivors as he cradles a fallen companion also speaks strongly to the film's core message, and is a quite striking moment in the middle of what are essentially scenes of carnage. On its Spanish release in 1976, the film was not a major box office success, particularly when compared to its predecessor. Some critics were particularly scathing, concentrating their wrath on the opening prologue, which they felt served no purpose and denied the film any plausibility of suspense. However, these reviews were not universal, and it still won a Critics' Award at the Fantastic Film Festival in 1977. Like many of the films in this series, it has, of course, subsequently gained a cult following, though it is still perhaps not as widely known outside of horror circles as it should be. Named as an inspiration by Guillermo del Toro and Edgar Wright, it is an intense and shocking political and personal statement, and I think it's a pity that Chicho didn't continue to make more genre films. The film was remade in 2012 as Come Out and Play, and this was a Mexican production spearheaded by actor-producers Diego Luna and Gael Garcia Bernal. The director himself was billed simply as Makhinoff, a deliberately, and some might say pretentiously, mysterious figure who appeared wearing a mask in a brief online video manifesto and whose true identity is still unknown. There were some rumours that it was in fact Eli Roth, although this seems rather unlikely and is pure speculation. Shot on an isolated Mexican island, it used island residents for some of the scenes and is a very faithful remake of the original. And therein lies the problem. In much the same way that Gus Van Sant's remake of Psycho offers us a shot-for-shot retread and nothing else, Come Out and Play brings nothing new to the table, and despite its beautiful cinematography, I found it to be rather lackluster. Chicho Serrador returned to working in television and received the Lifetime Achievement Award presented by the Spanish Television Academy in 2002. He also received the National Television Award presented by the Spanish Ministry of Culture in 2010, and an honorary Goya was presented by the Spanish film industry in 2018. He passed away on June 7th, 2019, at the age of 83. Both Village of the Damned and Who Can Kill a Child highlight the journey of the killer child trope, showing its path from menacing otherness to violent ferocity. Whilst the first film is based on the quiet speculative fiction and very Britishness of author John Wyndham, Who Can Kill a Child is more feral and seems more akin to some of the works of Ray Bradbury. The story Let's Play Poison, in particular, springs to mind. Together, they act as markers on a roadmap that would go on to include films like The Godsend from Great Britain in 1980, The Children, again from Great Britain, in 2008, as well as more recent works such as Cuckoo in the Nest Story Orphan from 2009, Changeling Story The Hole in the Ground from 2019, and the quite brilliant Norwegian film The Innocents from 2021. And given that, as we have seen, this subgenre is most often used to express the concerns and anxieties that the world is feeling at the time, I can only imagine that there are going to be many, many more demonic children to come. All of this brings me to the end of this week's episode. Thank you for listening, and if you've enjoyed the show, please do take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also contact me at thehorrorddoublebill@gmail.com and follow us on Instagram at thehorrorddoublebill. Next week, we're going to explore two rather unusual takes on vampire mythology. For our first film, we return to Val Lewton's RKO Studios for Isle of the Dead from 1945, which also gives me an opportunity to discuss the career of one of my horror favourites, the great Boris Karloff. Then we're going to travel to Pennsylvania for George A. Romero's Martin, a psychological study of a young man who may, then again he may not, be a vampire. Isle of the Dead is, at the time of recording, available in the UK on the Internet Archive, whilst Martin is currently available for free to stream with ads on Tubi, or for rental from an online presence that I'm trying very hard to stop mentioning. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion. And until then, have a really great week. Goodbye.